they can also send commands if they needed to the spacecraft.
Yeah, and we can see Dragon has a busy schedule ahead, but even in space, it still takes two to tango. The International Space Station is also a factor in the mix for this dance-like approach operation. So let's check in with NASA's Sandra Jones in Houston. How's it going over there, Sandra?
Hey, Leah, good morning and welcome to the International Space Station Flight Control Room at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. We are gearing up for this morning's docking and looking forward to having Crew-7 on board Space Station here soon. But before the crew can come aboard, Endurance will complete its docking.
4.010, suit downing and audio configuration is complete.
And on the big loop, SpaceX copies, and you are go to begin 4.011 for suit leak check.
Copy, go to begin 4.011 suit leak check.
And those words up to Jasmine Mogbelli, the SpaceX Endurance commander. But on board the International Space Station, NASA astronauts Steve Bowen and Woody Hoberg are going to be in the station's cupola using special software to help track Dragon's approach and make sure it stays in the expected zones. Once Dragon is docked, Hoberg will be primed to start hatch opening operations, and he'll start by opening the large hatch on Node 2 Zenith, giving him access into the pressurized mating adapter. Then the crew will have to pressurize the vestibule, which is the small space between hatches on Dragon and Space Station. Because this was exposed to vacuum prior to docking, the crew will need to fill it with air and make sure its pressure is nearly equal with the atmospheric pressure on Dragon and the Space Station. Hoberg will then use a small valve on the station's hatch to slowly introduce air into the station's vestibule. Flight controllers here in Houston will monitor and verify the pressure readings to make sure that everything is leak-free before we get ready to open up the hatches. Here in Mission Control, NASA Flight Director Judd Freeling is leading the team for Dragon's approach and docking today. And to their right is our Capcom today, Amy Dill, who will be communicating with the crew aboard Space Station. Now, as you may know, right now there are 7 astronauts aboard the space station, but of course that number will jump up to 11 once Crew-7 arrives on board. So again, we're excited to get our Crew-7 astronauts aboard to work on handover and orientation with the Crew-6 astronauts before they depart Space Station. But for now, that's the latest from here in Mission Control, so back over to Hawthorne.
Thanks, Sandra. So while we wait for our next milestone, let's take a moment to meet our crew. Captain Jasmine Mogbelli hails from Baldwin, New York, and earned a bachelor's degree in aerospace engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a master's degree in aerospace engineering from the Naval Postgraduate School. She also graduated with honors from the U.S. Naval Test Pilot School, and as an AH-1W Super Cobra pilot and Marine Corps test pilot, she has flown more than 150 missions, accruing 2,000 hours of flight time in more than 25 different aircraft. At the time of her selection as an astronaut, Mogbelli was testing H-1 helicopters and serving as the Quality Assurance and Avionics Officer for VMX-1. She is also the proud mom of twin girls. They were really sweet the other night in their SpaceX replica suits when they said farewell. Loved it.
So cute. This is pilot Andreas Mogeson's second trip to the space station. His first was as the flight engineer for the ESA IRIS mission in 2015. Mogeson has logged 9 days, 20 hours, and 9 minutes in space. He was born in Copenhagen, Denmark, and graduated with an international baccalaureate from the Copenhagen International School, a master's degree in aeronautical engineering from Imperial College London, and a doctorate in aerospace engineering from the University of Texas at Austin. In 2015, Mogeson became the first Danish person to go to space, and currently...
Dragon on the big loop, ready to pressurize.
And Dragon, SpaceX on the big loop, you are go to initiate suit leak check.
And we do not show that the cameras are internal.
And Dragon SpaceX on Dragon to Ground. We are seeing good video.
Yeah, Dragon copies.
And some comms confirming that the crew is go for leak checks. Now, currently, he is serving, Andreas Mogensen is serving as the European Astronaut Liaison Officer to NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston.
Next up, we have mission specialist Satoshi Furukawa. His interest in space began when he was 5 years old and saw the Apollo 11 moon landing on TV. It's just amazing to me. He was also a fan of the Japanese TV space hero Ultra 7, and his professional career began as a medical doctor. But after seeing a news report about Japan auditioning for new astronauts to do science experiments on the space station, he decided to apply. And he was selected by the National Space Development Agency of Japan to be an astronaut candidate in 1999. His first mission to the International Space Station was as a flight engineer for Expedition 28 and 29 that launched from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in June 2011.
Mission specialist Konstantin Borisov was selected to be a cosmonaut in 2018, and this will be his first trip to space. He has a Bachelor of Economics from the Russian Academy of Economics, a Master's of Science and Operations Research and Systems Analysis from Warwick University in Coventry, UK, and a Master's in Aircraft Life Support Systems from the Moscow Aviation Institute. He has worked for companies such as Volvo and the Boston Consulting Group. He is also an experienced freediving instructor, an international freediving judge, and the co-owner of Equilibrium Freediving School.
So that is our very international crew. 4 crew members. Again, we've just completed the approach initiation burn. We're looking for docking to happen at about 9:05 Eastern time today, so 6:05 a.m. Pacific coming up. Again, that's just a little over an hour and a half from now. This view on the right of your screen is Mission Control here in Hawthorne. That is where Dragon spacecraft itself is being commanded. We just heard from Sandra Jones in Houston, in Mission Control Houston, where the International Space Station is being commanded.
And there you can see on your screen the Dragon spacecraft. It is about 27 feet tall.
There are some differences in this Dragon spacecraft that we see now, the second iteration, and the first one, where at the bottom they're pointing out those solar cells. Those are on the base of the trunk of Dragon. The previous iteration of Dragon had solar arrays, and of course, trunk is jettisoned ahead of re-entry, so it'll stay attached the entire time while we're on the International Space Station. But only that top half, that top portion where the crew is inside, of course, that's what brings everyone home and safely splashes down off the coast of Florida. And we expect to see that happen in just about a week with our Crew-6 crew members currently living on the International Space Station. They arrived about 6 months ago.
Dragon, we show 4 good suit leak checks.
And on the big loop, we see the same.
And we just heard confirmation of 4 good suit leak checks, so that's great news. Basically, the crew is prepared for docking to the station. They do have to make sure that their suits are working properly prior to docking to the station.
So taking a look here at the suits themselves, these are custom fitted for each crew member. A 3D printed helmet accompanies the spacesuit. These are pretty sleek. They are used for dynamic portions of the mission. That's why they're able to get out of them during the free flight portion. So again, they're suited up. We've had those leak checks. They're able to get air conditioning as well as communications through these suits. There's a hookup on the side of their seat with which they would plug into that keeps them cool, keeps them comfortable on the flight.
Yeah, we always like to say that the Dragon spacesuits are an extension of the Dragon capsule itself, because they do need to work together basically as one unit to ensure that the crew is safe. Needs to provide the same nitrox air inside of the suit if needed, just as inside of the cabin. So very much so like one unit working together.
So the next milestone coming up is the mid-course maneuver. It can be done. It's about halfway from our starting point of approach initiation to waypoint 0. So it's a small burn. It helps fine-tune that approach. We're targeting, of course, that precise 400 meters directly below the station. And that's what the approach initiation burn did for us, was bring us up to that 400-meter point. Of course, we are still en route to that point, but we also passed through waypoint 0 on the way. Coming up next, we will be looking to pass through waypoint. Well, we will pass through waypoint 0, and then we'll pause at waypoint 1.
And there you can see that maneuver there as the space station will move upwards into waypoint 1. And you can see on your screen the graphic says the keep out sphere. This is an imaginary sphere, but basically it's a 3D sphere where the vehicle has a few checkpoints in order to make its way to the International Space Station. These are checkpoints that enable to make sure that everything is safe as the vehicle approaches and docks with the International Space Station.
And of course, today we've talked about we are docking to the Zenith port. This is the space-facing port on the International Space Station. That's really the easiest way to say it, because there necessarily isn't an up or down in space. And Dragon Endurance today is joining Dragon Endeavour, which is docked to the forwardmost port of the International Space Station, both on Node 2. So hopefully we get some interesting pictures of both Dragons docked together. Again, we do this so that the crews have time for a handover period. They're able to, pass on what they've learned, pass on anything throughout the flight before Crew 6 heads home themselves.
And this is a very cool graphic. You can kind of see exactly where Dragon is relative to the space station. And basically, Dragon is trying to align itself with the International Space Station into the same orbit. And also a cool thing that you can also see in this graphic is where the Hubble Space Telescope is relative to both the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station, which are both in low Earth orbit.
We are taking your questions on X with the hashtag AskNASA. So if you're wondering something, we will definitely try our best to bring that up and answer it here. So let's see if we have anything. Are there health monitors that continuously check astronauts' vitals during preparation and flight? If so, what happens if it's noticeable that one of them is uncomfortable? So when they're in their suits, they do have the ability to monitor their health and their vitals and things like that here on the ground. But when they're not in their suits, they don't have that availability, and they don't necessarily always need to. The crew can always report how they're feeling as well. We also have something similar in our suits on a spacewalk. So the flight surgeon is able to monitor on the ground, kind of the consumables is what we call it. So the amount of oxygen or the temperature of the astronaut. And so they can recommend things like maybe let's pause here, or, whatever we need to do to either extend the time that they're available to use the suit, or just to make sure that they're comfortable and can get the work done on the space station.
Yeah, very cool. We've got another one here. Is there a difference in the amount of fuel and propellant for cargo, payload, or crew? Yeah, that's a very interesting question. One thing to point out is that the cargo Dragon actually does not have the abort thrusters, the Draco thrusters, that the crew vehicle have. So essentially, you would use less fuel or need less fuel for a cargo mission than for the crew mission.
Yeah, of course, we call those the Super Dracos, and those are inhibited once we get on orbit. So those are no longer necessary, no longer in use for the flight. Any of the thrusters that are being used are either the service section Dracos or the forward bulkhead Dracos. Those Super Draco thrusters around the base of the capsule are really only to help in a launch abort scenario. This question, what is the expected time of arrival on the International Space Station? So we are a couple of hours away. Well, actually less than that. We expect to see arrival at 6:05 a.m. Pacific time, 9:05 a.m. Eastern time. So we're going to see things getting moving along pretty quickly here. Moving along into our next milestones. I think coming up next, we will pass through waypoint 0. Again, it's not a stopping point. It's just another way we can monitor Dragon's approach to the International Space Station.
And we've got one more question here. What science are we expecting from Crew-7, and what impact is it going to have in future interstellar travel?
I don't know about future interstellar travel necessarily, but of course, I love the opportunity to talk about the science here. There are several investigations going up that Crew-7 will work on. Some of the designers of spacecraft and spacesuits to support the exploration of other planets, they are considering the possibility that humans carry microbes to like bacteria, anything like that, to those locations. So for the ISS external microorganisms mission, the astronauts are going to go on a spacewalk and swab the outside of the space station to determine if the space station releases microorganisms through the life support system vents, and if anything could live out there in the vacuum of space. So I think that one is really interesting.
Yeah, that would be very interesting to know. The International Space Station is in low Earth orbit, so that's pretty close to Earth. So it'd be very, very interesting if, they did find or discover something new.
Yeah, of course, it's something I think that we talk a lot about, too, as we look at interplanetary travel, too, and wanting to keep those locations as clean as possible. That's why you have spacecraft in clean rooms. That's why you have people suited up, wearing caps so that their hairs don't even fall onto a vehicle, because we want to make sure when we arrive at a future destination, whether it's the moon, whether it's Mars, that we are seeing something as it was and not as influenced by humans. That way, if we discover anything microbial there, we know it's natural there. It's not coming from Earth with us.
Now on your screen, on the left-hand side is Mission Control Hawthorne. This is the team that's actually monitoring Dragon, and they monitor Dragon from liftoff all the way to the crew arriving at the International Space Station, as well as when the crew returns back home all the way through splashdown. That mission control room in Hawthorne, that's the team that is monitoring Dragon and the crew throughout the entire mission.
Yeah, and obviously we are getting into joint operations now. That means both of these teams are working together. So previously, the International Space Station was obviously clearly monitoring Dragon's flight, but mainly focused on the International Space Station and preparing it for docking. But now these teams are really working in tandem as we get closer to those two vehicles linking up. Again, coming up in just a little over an hour from now, 6:05 a.m. Pacific, 9:05 a.m. Eastern time.
Yeah, and this really shows that teamwork makes the dream work.
I think you're 100% right. So we were talking a little bit about the science that Crew-7 will be working on. Of course, the International Space Station has been in orbit almost or been constantly inhabited for almost 23 years now. So there have been thousands, I would think, I know hundreds, definitely over 1,000 scientific experiments going on the International Space Station. Another one of these looks at the microgravity and artificial day and night cycles on the International Space Station. So obviously here on Earth, we have our circadian rhythm that helps us regulate when it's day, when it's nighttime. Sometimes we wake up in the middle of the night to cover a crew mission to the International Space Station. But the microgravity and those artificial day and night cycles, they can affect the astronauts. They change the daily rhythm, change their sleep pattern. That can affect their health, their well-being, any cognitive performance. So there is an investigation from the European Space Agency, ESA. It's called Sleep in Orbit, and that'll look at the physiological differences between sleep on Earth and in space. They're going to use an EEG device. It'll measure the brain activity of the astronauts during sleep, help analyze that down on the ground. So really interesting.
Yeah, that does sound very interesting, especially when the International Space Station sees about 16 orbits a day. I can't imagine, what that does to the human body or the human mind when typically, you associate daytime with sunlight and nighttime with darkness.
Right.
And you're kind of getting that fluctuation throughout the entire day. So I wonder how that kind of changes somebody's body when they're there for, 6 months or more.
And tally-ho on Dragon from the International Space Station. You can see that little blinking light. That is our Crew-7, crew of 4, getting closer and closer to the International Space Station. Of course, we did have our approach initiation burn. We are standing by. We may see a mid-course maneuver. This is an optional burn just to help fine-tune that approach to the International Space Station. We will pass through waypoints. And we'll do that brief pause. I'm pulling up my data right now. Let's see. We are just about a mile from the International Space Station. So if you've ever run a mile before, you can run between Dragon and the space station. That's how close they are. Of course, it is a very slow and steady approach at this point when you have 2 spacecraft, getting ready to connect. It's very fine-tuned. And I just did get confirmation the mid-course maneuver is underway. This will be a short burn. Again, just fine-tuning, making sure we put Dragon exactly where we want it before it docks to the zenith or the space-facing port on the International Space Station.
And kind of going back to what you see on your screen, much like a ship has starboard and port to that green and red light to see the orientation. Dragon and these spacecraft also have that same green and red light so that you can tell what the orientation of the vehicle is in.
So we have, again, conducted the approach initiation burn. We are in the mid-course maneuver right now. Again, very short burn just to confirm and make sure we're exactly where we want to be on Dragon. Soon we should be able to see some views of the International Space Station from Dragon as well. Now we are docking to the zenith port today, the space-facing port. We may not have views at the time of docking. That is because when we send signals from the cameras, we don't want it to bounce back off of Dragon. That can damage the cameras themselves. So we may not have views during that point as it prepares to dock, at least not from the closest camera, but we will have confirmation.
And Dragon SpaceX on the big loop, we had a nominal mid-course correction and the trajectory has converged on waypoint 0. Expect waypoint 0 arrival at 1217 Zulu.
SpaceX Dragon copies all and copy 1217.
Great news. We had confirmation that the mid-course maneuver is complete and that we are on track to waypoint 0 at the 5:17 a.m. Pacific time timestamp there, which is just about 18 minutes from now.
And of course, they could hold at waypoint 0 if they wanted to, but we don't have anything that's tracking for us to do that at this time. They'll be able to move right through waypoint 1. I believe that's about 220 meters from the station. And these pauses are built in so that we can continue to check the systems on Dragon as well as on the International Space Station side. Just make sure everyone is still performing optimally before we get into this delicate dance, as we've called it before. And like we were just talking about, we see liftoff happen so fast. The crew is traveling very quickly, catching up to the International Space Station. Some of these burns last quite a long time, but as we get closer and closer, it is much slower, much more paced as we get into the approach ellipsoid, the keep out sphere, just bringing these two spacecraft closer together and making sure that we are very careful as we bring them together in space. So talking a little bit more about some of the science that is happening on board. For longer journeys to the moon and Mars, we've talked a little bit about this. The International Space Station is such an amazing test bed for us to conduct scientific research, experiments themselves, but also on human bodies. So as we think about those missions, the scientists are looking at how this extended time in space affects the human body, because of course we know missions to Mars are going to be longer than these 6-month mission durations to the International Space Station. So astronauts on these missions of various length can participate in an integrated set of studies that monitor their health before, during, and after the missions. These are 14 experiments. They are collectively called the Complement of Integrated Protocols for Human Exploration Research. To shorten that, we just call it CIPHER. These collect multiple physiological and psychological measures of the human response to time and space. So these results could play a pivotal role in ensuring the safety, the health, the success of astronauts on deep space exploration missions, which of course is our next big goal.
Right, like we've sent humans, hundreds of thousands of miles away, but on interplanetary missions, they're going to be going potentially millions of miles away, right? And we would like to know, maybe how these long duration missions affect the body, so that we can understand how the body will react, in a longer period of time, maybe longer than 6 months. It could be months, it could be years. And,
we do have NASA astronaut Frank Rubio on board, who will, when he comes home, hold the record for the longest amount of time in space. I believe it's 371 days. So over a year in space for an American astronaut. That'll be the new record. He is still on board. We expect to see him come home next month. So I know he must be looking forward to his return to Earth. Now, our next milestone is we expect waypoint 0 arrival. Again, that'll be at about 5:17 a.m. Pacific time, so about 15 minutes from now. And again, if you're just tuning in, this is Dragon making its way to the International Space Station, this view coming from the space station itself.
And again, we are taking your questions on X with the hashtag AskNASA. See if we have some questions here. How long was the prep for this mission overall? Ooh, that's a great question.
Yeah, so, a lot of these crew members have been assigned to this mission for probably over a year-ish, but they've been astronauts for longer, or a cosmonaut for longer. We know Satoshi Furukawa was selected as an astronaut in 1999. So upon selection, you really start your prep for your missions, even though you don't necessarily know what mission you'll be on at that time. But you start things immediately, like training how to use the systems on the International Space Station, how to perform maintenance, how to do spacewalks. So your training really starts the day you become an astronaut candidate. However, training for this mission gets a little more intense when they are assigned, and when they can come here to Hawthorne and start training with the teams here, as well as training specific experiments they might conduct on the International Space Station.
Right. It's not just training for the liftoff and launch to the International Space Station, but it's all the training that includes, flying, potentially flying Dragon if needed, performing the science experiments on the International Space Station. Sometimes the astronauts actually have to go and help, build or rebuild or maintenance parts of the International Space Station, so they'll need training on that as well. So it's a pretty dynamic training program for these astronauts.
You've got a live look inside Dragon Endurance right now. That's pilot and Commander Jasmine Mobelli and pilot Andreas Mogensen just monitoring the spacecraft's progress.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop. Ground has pulled go for approach 0 and 1 and will enable the maneuver shortly.
SpaceX Dragon copies go for approach 0 and 1.
And those words confirming that we are good to continue the approach to the International Space Station, and we'll pass through waypoint 0. Again, we expect that waypoint 0 mark to come at about 5:17 a.m. Pacific, so about 12 minutes from now. Again, they will not pause there. They will go to pass through to waypoint 1. That's about 220 meters away from the International Space Station. This view again from inside Dragon, crew monitoring as Dragon flies autonomously to the International Space Station, continuing to get closer and closer. That approach initiation burn brought us up about 400 meters directly below the station. We are now about 686 meters from the station, or about 0.4 miles. So getting closer and closer, again, looking for docking at 9:05 a.m. Eastern, 6:05 a.m. Pacific, so almost exactly an hour from now.
And we did see views of the International Space Station before, which looked like a tiny little dot, and now we are getting so close that you can really see the International Space Station there, and that's on your left-hand screen. And looking from the International Space Station to Dragon on your right-hand screen, getting a really cool view of Dragon.
And you see that glow. That is the spacecraft are both going into an orbital daytime. So we've talked about how the at orbital velocity, you're orbiting the Earth 17,500 miles per hour. You see a sunrise or a sunset every 45 minutes. So they're going into that sunrise period. That's why you saw that glow, that blooming on the camera. They will be there again for about 45 minutes. It does look like we may dock just as we get into an orbital nighttime. But again, this view on your right-hand side of the screen, the Dragon capsule itself, and then its destination on the left, the International Space Station, both have eyes on each other. And we are in the big loop, as we talked about earlier, meaning they can all communicate on the same communication network.
And we did get a go for approaching waypoint 0 as well as waypoint 1. We're just about 10 minutes away from the expected time of arrival at waypoint 0. And again, this is just a checkpoint. They do not need to stop. They can continue to pass through waypoint 0 and move to waypoint 1, which will swing it up and out in front of the space station. And it'll pause at a distance of approximately 220 meters away from the station.
Now, right now, as we speak, the International Space Station has just started flying over the state of Washington. It's about to fly directly over Seattle. So if you're in the area, it is about to cross over into Canada as well. So if you're in that area near that border, go outside, maybe look up. You can always check out spotthestation.nasa.gov to see when it'll fly over you. But it is going to pass over the continental U.S. Right now. It's flying right over the state of Washington. So I'm sure if they looked down right now, would have beautiful views of the mountain ranges there. It'll be south of Calgary here pretty shortly.
And as you mentioned earlier, you don't need a telescope to see the International Space Station. You can actually see it with the naked eye. It's about the size of a football field and big enough for you to walk outside and be able to see it pass by.
And I know they can't see me, but I always wave.
Hey, you never know.
So again, things still progressing pretty smoothly this morning. Next milestone being that they will pass through, will not stop at waypoint 0, less than 8 minutes from now. And a reminder, we are going to the zenith, or the space-facing port of the International Space Station today. They will be next-door neighbors with Dragon Endeavour, which is at the forward-facing port on Node 2. And right now on the International Space Station, we have 7 crew members. So we are going to have 11 people living and working on the orbiting laboratory for the next several days. We'll start looking at an undocking timeline and a splashdown date for Crew-6 pretty soon. But we want to make sure they get that handover time. So right now, again, 7 people living on the space station. Right now, it looks like 4 of them are having their midday meal. So on the space station, they use Greenwich Mean Time. It's just a little bit after noon there, about 12:10 p.m. A few of them are eating. Again, this is a weekend day, so technically, sometimes if there's not operations going on, they do get time off on the weekends. They're able to relax, talk to family members. Right now, several of them are eating, and then Woody Hoberg will step into the Dragon approach monitoring. He will also work on pressurizing the vestibule once we are docked.
And on your screen is a pretty cool view from the International Space Station looking at Dragon. You could see the nose cone deployed, and you can also see some of the thrusters. They're using the Draco thrusters to maneuver Dragon towards the International Space Station. You can see Earth in the background.
Yeah, right now they are flying over Saskatchewan, so south of Saskatoon. That's the view below Dragon there. And then Dragon's view of the International Space Station. So if you're in that area, go take a look up. You might spot our crew members. Again, less than an hour away from docking now. It will bring that crew up to 7 people.
And we are about 5 minutes from reaching waypoint 0. Expected time is 5:17 a.m. Pacific time.
So during that crew handover period, when we talked about, these 11 crew members on the International Space Station, we have Crew-6. That consists of Stephen Bowen, Woody Hoberg, Sultan Al-Nayati, and Andrei Fedyayev. They have been living up there for about 6 months now. And before we bring them home, we want them to be able to talk to Crew-7. We have some first-time flyers, especially on this spacecraft. So we want them to be able to show them the ropes of what's going on aboard the International Space Station. They can hand over any science experiments that they've been working on, show them any of the safety protocols. That's actually one of the very first things that they will do right after they dock. They will move into an ISS safety briefing. They get a lot of training on the ground about how to handle any contingencies or off-nominal situations, but once you get in space, it's just different. You need to do it again. You need the refresher. So it's, safety is the utmost importance. So that's the first thing that they'll do after they dock and do their welcoming ceremony for us. But that crew handover period, it gives a nice buffer for these team members to be able to share what's been happening on the International Space Station over the last 6 months with this crew who has just arrived. This view from another camera on the International Space Station. Again, this station right now is about 262 statute miles over Earth, actually flying over Ontario at this point. It's moving pretty fast. Just a couple minutes ago, it was flying over Washington State. We're now all the way over Ontario, so 17,500 miles an hour. That is about 5 miles per second. Quite speedy.
And speed is relative, so it doesn't look that fast on your screen, but that is very, very fast.
We are just a few minutes now from passing through waypoint 0. And we expect to pass through waypoint 1 as well. That'll be about 20-25 minutes following our pass through waypoint 0. Again, these are points built into the docking process. That way, if we needed to hold at these, we definitely can. It's a great opportunity to check out any systems, but the teams here in Hawthorne as well as in Houston have pulled go. They're not tracking any issues that would preclude us from a safe docking. Again, looking at that coming up at about 6:05 a.m. Pacific. And our Cronus flight controller in Houston is the one who is navigating these cameras on the International Space Station. So they always do a great job of getting us some really amazing views as Dragon gets closer.
Again, just as a reminder, waypoint 0 will mean that Dragon is 400 meters directly below station, and as it maneuvers to waypoint 1, that is basically swinging the vehicle to out in front of the station. It will be approximately 220 meters away from station. And that is coming up here in just about 2 minutes from now. We're reaching waypoint 0 is coming up in about 2 minutes.
And waypoint 1 puts us on the docking axis, so it pretty much lines us directly up with that corridor that the spacecraft will follow all the way in to where it docks on the zenith port of the International Space Station. There is a pause at waypoint 2. That's about 20 meters away, so that is kind of the final check of all the systems on both sides of the spacecrafts to make sure that everyone's still go for docking. We're not tracking any major issues. They can hold there for any lighting changes if they wanted to, but not always necessary. So sometimes it's a brief pause, and sometimes they just hold to make sure that everything is checking out as planned.
And you did just see a view inside of the cabin of Dragon, and you saw our astronauts, our commander and pilot there, basically just monitoring. Dragon is an autonomous vehicle, so really all the crew needs to do is just monitor as they approach the station. There's really no manual driving or flying at this point.
This gives you a great view with the nose cone open. That's where the docking mechanism is located. That's the hatch through which these astronauts will fly through Dragon and into the International Space Station. Of course, yesterday during launch, we saw them enter through the side hatch. They won't use that again until they splash down and are back on Earth and egress on the recovery ship. So we just got confirmation. We have arrived at waypoint 0. We are converging our trajectory on waypoint 1. So again, things continuing to move smoothly. We'll start to get a different view of the International Space Station as we're going to be going to the zenith port. So we're going to be going directly above it. We'll be looking down on the space station. So that view we have right now of the space station looking down on Dragon, it'll be flip-flopped. So Dragon will be looking down on the space station and see Earth below that. So again, we've just reached waypoint 0, which means Dragon is 400 meters directly below station. And we can see it in views now coming from the International Space Station. But coming up, Dragon will move from waypoint 0 to waypoint 1. That'll swing it up and out in front of the space station, actually directly above it, pausing at a distance of approximately 220 meters. Again, that puts us on the docking axis. That essentially means it's directly in front of the docking port. And again, we've heard teams do the go, no go polls. Everything remains go for us this morning. So again, coming up next, we will see
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop. Approach 0 has started and the trajectory has converged on waypoint 1. Expect arrival at waypoint 1 around 1259er UTC.
SpaceX Dragon copies on the big loop, arrival at waypoint 1 at 1259er.
And just the core communicating with the crew, confirming that they are on their way to waypoint 1. Now, this maneuver from waypoint 0 to waypoint 1 is coming up in just about 30 minutes from now. So we do have some time as this maneuver happens. This is a slow and steady process. Again, we are traveling at 17,500 miles per hour, but the process is slow and steady as we pass through each one of these checkpoints to make sure that we can monitor everything that's happening and make sure that the vehicle's safe, the crew is safe, as well as the International Space Station is also safe before we begin docking with the space station.
We were just talking about what's underneath the nose cone. So obviously the docking port, but we also have those forward bulkhead thrusters. We use those for some of the larger burns. We also have the service section Draco thrusters. Those are positioned around the spacecraft. We'll just be using those service section Dracos as we get closer to the International Space Station. Again, very fine-tuned. And this, I just noticed, is very cool. On the left side of your screen, up a little, if you're looking towards the top of the International Space Station or towards the top of your screen, you can see Dragon Endeavour docked to that forward-facing port. Again, we are going to the Zenith port, so you can see that outline perfectly. That's so fascinating. You can also see some of those International Space Station rollout solar arrays, those IROSAs. If you look towards the right side, you know, they look like they are a little bit detached, sort of. They are mounted differently on our solar arrays. Again, we have passed through waypoint 0, heading up to waypoint 1. International Space Station looking especially beautiful this morning. And we are in that orbital daytime. We are now flying over the Atlantic Ocean, so we have at this point passed over the continental US, North America.
And on your left-hand screen is a view inside of Dragon. On your left-hand side is Commander Jasmine Mogbelli, and on your right-hand side is the pilot for this mission, Andreas Mogensen. Again, they are just monitoring. They are able to confirm, you know, on their displays that what they see matches what we see here in Mission Control as they make their way to docking to the International Space Station. And these views are really awesome. Seeing Earth in the background, looking almost so crisp there.
I know. And Crew-7, once they arrive at the International Space Station, they will have these beautiful views for about 6 months, living and working, doing science and research on the International Space Station. We did get an updated docking time. It has shifted just a few minutes to the right. We're now tracking 9:08 a.m. Eastern Time. Literally just a 3-minute change, so just fine-tuning after we've done the approach initiation burn and that mid-course maneuver. Again, we've passed through waypoint 0, moving up toward waypoint 1. Things continue to look good so far for Dragon Endurance on its journey to the International Space Station. And this, the astronauts, the first crew to fly on a spacecraft, have the opportunity to name it. And so the first flight of Endurance was the Crew-3 mission. It was named Endurance by the astronauts themselves. Obviously, they said it's a tribute to the tenacity of the human spirit as we push farther than ever with commercial opportunities in low Earth orbit and plans to go to the moon and Mars. So common theme.
Awesome. We're seeing another view from the International Space Station. Looking.
Yeah, if you look closely, there's Dragon in the center there. Again, our Cronus flight controller tracking these views for us in Mission Control Houston.
Thank you, Cronus. And as a reminder, as Dragon approached waypoint 0, it was directly under the International Space Station. As it moves to waypoint 1, it's actually going to swing up and align itself with the space station. So you no longer will be looking down from the space station and have that view of Earth in the background, because it will be aligned with the docking port, which is the zenith port today. It's the space-facing side of the International Space Station.
Once our astronauts arrive and our cosmonaut arrive to the International Space Station today, they will be members of Expedition 69. That will remain their designation, so they won't keep these roles, these titles that they have right now. You know, we have Jasmine Mogbelli as our commander. Once she gets to the International Space Station, she will be a flight engineer. And they will remain Expedition 69 until departure of Soyuz next month. That'll be bringing Frank Rubio home. That is when we will enter Expedition 70. So their titles will change over at that point to Expedition 70 crew members. We're about 25 minutes until we expect to reach waypoint 1. Sorry, about 35 minutes, I believe. Again, that's that 220 meter. It can be used as a hold point. I don't think we intend to use it as a hold point today, but it is on the docking axis. It'll be directly above the International Space Station, directly above that zenith port on Node 2. All right, and a reminder, we are taking your questions on X with the hashtag AskNASA. We have one from Sahid asking if there are any problems with docking if they are on the dark side of the Earth, which it does happen several times a day. We see that happen about every 45, 90 minutes, or sorry, a sunrise, sunset every 45 minutes. And do they face visibility issues? So Dragon is fully autonomous. It uses LiDAR to track the International Space Station and to line up with that docking port. The crew members do have the opportunity to take control if needed, but they don't necessarily need to wait for that lighting. The Dragon knows where the station's docking port is, and we have lights out on the exterior of the International Space Station anyway. So sometimes we do hold for lighting just to double confirm, just to make sure, but there is usually no problem docking in darkness.
Yeah, I believe it's actually more of a problem when it's too bright. So when it's too bright, they do take a pause and wait for it to get a little bit darker, just to make sure that, again, because this is an autonomous vehicle, make sure that the Dragon spacecraft can actually see the International Space Station. And we are taking questions on X with the hashtag AskNASA. And this one is, where can I see the post-launch news conference from yesterday? And also, you're doing a good job. Good job,
Thank you
Leah.
so much. Good job, Jesse. Thank you so much. You can find the post-launch news conference on NASA's YouTube. They did a great job breaking down the ascent and what it looks like for this rendezvous profile. So if you want to go back, take a look at NASA's YouTube, you can search for the Crew-7 post-launch news conference, and it should come right up. Next question is, when will Crew-7 be back to Earth?
Well, these are long-duration rotational missions, but the durations are approximately 6 months. So every 6 months, we fly a crew up to the International Space Station, and the crew on board will then return back home. So Crew-7 will be up there for about 6 months and come back.
We're starting to see the views change a little bit. You know, we were looking directly down on Dragon, but now we are swinging up and above the International Space Station, because we'll be docking to that Zenith port. So again, like I mentioned earlier, we were looking directly down on Dragon with the Earth below it. Pretty soon, Dragon will be looking directly down on the International Space Station with the Earth below it. Looks like right now they are flying off the west coast of Senegal, about 260 statute miles above Earth.
And if you're just now joining us, you are tuned in to the Crew-7 mission. The crew launched last night at 12:27 a.m. Eastern Time. 12:27 a.m. Pacific Time, 3:27 a.m. Eastern Time. And now the crew is making their way to the International Space Station. We've already had a few burns. We've passed through checkpoint waypoint 0, and now the vehicle is swinging up towards waypoint 1. We are just under 25 minutes away from the expected time of arrival to waypoint 1, which will put the vehicle in line with the docking adapter on the International Space Station, and also put the vehicle directly above the International Space Station.
So if you're tracking, that's an almost 30-hour ride to orbit. The crew are suited up now. They are in their seats. They have not had to do so during the flight, and we just got a really cool view of one of those Draco thrusters firing, helping us fine-tune our approach to the space station. Our 4 crew members arriving today: Jasmine Mogbelli, Andreas Mogensen, Satoshi Furukawa, and Konstantin Borisov. Dragon looks pretty small in this picture, but we are getting closer and closer to the International Space Station. Waypoint 1 is our next really milestone. That'll be 220 meters directly above the station. We'll pass through that, head to waypoint 2, which is a hold point. It can be a brief pause. That's 20 meters away from the docking port. And once the astronauts arrive, they will be joining a crew of already 7 people living on the International Space Station, so bringing that total up to 11. The other astronauts and cosmonauts living on the station right now are Stephen Bowen, Woody Hoberg, Sultan Al-Nayati, Andrei Fedyaev, Frank Rubio, Sergei Prokopyev, and Dmitry Petelin.
And we just had a view from the International Space Station looking at Dragon from a bit further away. And now we've got a very good close-up as Dragon gets closer and closer to the International Space Station.
Yeah, looking crystal clear. Again, that nose cone is open. Of course, when we launch, it is closed. And when we re-enter its atmosphere, it's closed to protect that docking mechanism that's beneath it. So that's exactly the point that'll line up with that zenith port on the International Space Station. It'll dock. The teams on the space station will take some time to make sure they pressurize the vestibule. That's the space between the Dragon hatch and the space station hatch. So when Dragon docks, that space is going to be out of vacuum. It's been previously exposed to outer space. And we want to make sure that it's equalized before we open up those hatches and the crew floats in. So that is a process that takes about an hour-ish, you know, making sure that we've got all those levels equaled out before we welcome the crew aboard the space station. Yeah, this is another view from the International Space Station. You can see one of the robotic arms on the left, and close to center of your screen, that is Dragon. And that robotic arm is attached to the Japan exposed facility, so we are able to put some of our experiments outside in the vacuum of space. Again, we are about 22 minutes away from waypoint 1, reaching waypoint 1. Can be used as a hold point. We do not anticipate doing so today. We're heading to the zenith port of the space station on node 2, and it'll continue flying in. It'll be on that docking corridor until it's about 20 meters away. And we are looking for docking today at 9:08 a.m. Eastern Time, 6:08 a.m. Pacific Time. And this again is Dragon Endurance that we're looking at. It flew first on the Crew 3 mission. It also flew the Crew 5 astronauts to the International Space Station.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop. Expect reconfiguration of the C2V2 return link shortly.
SpaceX Dragon copies on the big loop.
And a reminder, we are taking your questions on X with the hashtag AskNASA. So if there's something you're curious about, let us know. This question from Jack: what have the astronauts been doing in between launch and docking?
Well, they've been floating around a bit. But they have had some rest periods, some meal periods. You know, they're able to eat while they're in microgravity as they're making their way to the International Space Station. After ascent, once they made it to orbit, they were able to get out of their spacesuits and actually enjoy microgravity. And they've also, you know, needed to follow some procedures. As we're getting closer and closer to the International Space Station, they did have to prepare for some of the burns that enable the Dragon vehicle to get or to approach the International Space Station. So a plethora of activities over the past 30 hours.
Yeah, they also get the opportunity to eat if they want to. They have some shelf-stable meals that they can choose from, and you'll probably hear after docking, they will report out what was consumed. Not necessarily the food itself, but they'll say this many packets from this bag. Everything is so meticulously tracked in space and on the International Space Station. It can be difficult. You know, it's not the same as here on Earth. If I put something down on the table, I know it's going to stay there thanks to gravity. But on the International Space Station, we want to make sure we know where everything is at all times, because it can float away pretty easily. So just reporting also what was consumed, that gives the teams here in Hawthorne as well as in Houston a good look at, you know, what is also available for later use as well.
Yeah, and on the broadcast for the launch of Crew-7, NASA astronaut Jessica Meir actually mentioned, you know, how good the meals ready to eat actually are. She really gave an ode to, you know, how cool it is to be able to bring, you know, some flavors from, you know, some of the astronauts' like favorite types of food with them to the International Space Station. On Dragon, they aren't able to heat up any of the food, but they are able to hydrate any dehydrated food while on Dragon. And then once they get to the International Space Station, they actually do have the ability to warm up food and have a hot meal. And we do have another question. Again, as a reminder, we are taking questions on X with the hashtag AskNASA. Do the astronauts stay in that seated position the entire trip there? So for Crew-7, that would be for 30 hours.
Yeah, no, that doesn't sound super comfortable, and thankfully they don't have to. So like we talked about, you know, after they get on orbit, after they're out of that dynamic period of flight, the nose cone is opened, they get a call from the Corps here in Hawthorne that they can get out of their seats as well as their suits. So they're able to take their suits off and kind of be in their own comfortable clothing, whatever they've worn underneath. We ask them to put those back on shortly before we get into this approach initiation phase. So they are back in their suits right now. They are also in their seats. Of course, we don't expect anything to be off nominal in this situation, and we are moving pretty slowly, but it's still considered a dynamic period of flight because we're getting closer to the International Space Station and docking itself. We are about 15 minutes from waypoint 1. Again, our next pit stop on the way to the space station, about 220 meters above the Node 2 Zenith docking port.
And Dragon SpaceX on the big loop. C2V2 link reconfiguration is complete. Could you give us a quick comm check?
SpaceX Dragon, comm check on the big loop.
We have you 5x5.
Have you seen?
Hearing that conversation between the Corps and the crew, that is Shiva Bharavaj down there in Mission Control, Hawthorne. And they were talking about C2V2, that's Common Communications for Visiting Vehicles. So the Dragon spacecraft and International Space Station both use this language essentially to talk with each other, and it is properly configured so they continue to have good communication between both of those spacecraft. So currently on board the International Space Station, judging by the timeline, it looks like Woody Hoberg is now in position monitoring Dragon's approach. They can actually send commands from Dragon or from the International Space Station to Dragon if need be, if there was some reason that we needed the spacecraft to retreat. Obviously, we're not tracking anything this morning, but he'll be monitoring that approach as they get closer all the way through docking, and then he'll be the person to work through the depressurization of the vestibule and make it a welcoming transition from Dragon to the space station for the 4 new crew members.
And we are currently maneuvering from waypoint 0 to waypoint 1. We are expecting to arrive at the waypoint 1 checkpoint at 5:59 a.m. Pacific time. And again, this will put Dragon directly above the International Space Station. So you could see on your screen, Dragon made its way to waypoint 0, which was directly under the International Space Station, so between Earth and the International Space Station. And now it is swinging upwards and will be above the International Space Station, basically on the space side of the station. And again, we are expecting that arrival at waypoint 1 at 5:59 a.m. Pacific time.
And we got the go from the International Space Station team that they are good to have Dragon proceed past waypoint 1. So waypoint 1, they will stop at waypoint 2. Again, that's about 20 meters from the space station. That's the final checkpoint before moving in. And we expect to see them at waypoint 1 in about 12 minutes from now. Shortly after that, it moves pretty quickly. It is slow and steady, but at the same time, we're anticipating docking at 6:08 a.m. Pacific. That is 9:08 a.m. Eastern time. So just about 30 minutes from now, we should see our new crew arrive at the space station. Of course, if we needed to, we can hold at waypoint 2 for quite a while, just to make sure we have conditions on the spacecraft, on the International Space Station, any lighting conditions, just the way we want them before we move on in.
And just to recap some of our milestones, we had an approach initiation burn at 4:29 a.m. Pacific time. That's 7:29 p.m. a.m. Eastern time. As well as we did require an approach initiation mid-course maneuver, which happened at 4:56 a.m. Pacific time, 7:56 a.m. Eastern time. And again, we've passed through waypoint 0. We're on our way to waypoint 1. And as Leah mentioned, after waypoint 1 is waypoint 2, just 20 meters from the International Space Station. There will be that will be a checkpoint where they will make sure that everything is good before docking. And again, docking is autonomous. Dragon is an autonomous vehicle, so the astronauts still are just monitoring all the way until the vehicle basically latches onto the International Space Station.
We'll start hearing more and more chatter, too, as we get closer between all the crew members. And one of the call-outs that we'll hear just as the crew is about to make contact with the International Space Station is CHOP, or that stands for Crew Hands-Off Point. That's about 2 meters from the space station. At that point, the crew should not be sending any commands to Dragon. However, again, we really don't anticipate that they would be because it is an autonomous docking. So about 10 minutes away till we reach waypoint 1. Again, we're going to move right on through, head to that waypoint 2 hold point, and then we are about 20 minutes away from docking itself. So again, we're docking to the Node 2 Zenith port today. That's the space-facing port. And this is, we may not see the docking. We may see it, but we have two bands of communication on the International Space Station. We have the KU band, which is how our video comes down. We have the S band, that's our sound and audio. The KU band antenna, we do something called KU masking. So we send commands to this antenna to not radiate in a certain area because it could reflect off of Dragon and the International Space Station. So we don't want that to radiate onto Dragon and back on the antenna itself. It can damage the antenna. It's a higher power KU link, so we don't want to damage that antenna dish if we don't have to, obviously. It can, risk the electronics inside, any tracking sensors. So we may not see docking. There is still a possibility. It just kind of depends on the location of those antennas at the time. But if we don't have video of the docking from that one location, obviously we will still have audio communications as well as comms with the crew to let us know that Dragon has arrived.
Again, if you're just now joining us, you are tuned into the Crew-7 mission. The Crew-7 crew is inside of that Dragon vehicle that you see there on your screen, and they're currently making their way to waypoint 1, which we expect to reach and pass through without a hold in about 7 minutes or so from now.
This view coming from a camera on the International Space Station of Dragon continuing its approach. Again, we are going up and above the space station, so we may eventually have some views of Dragon looking down on the station with the Earth below it. We do anticipate entering an orbital nighttime here shortly. It looks about like 10 minutes till the next sunset. Currently flying 269 statute miles over the Indian Ocean, south of Africa. Another view here from the International Space Station. Dragon is that big bright object pretty much in the center of your screen. And this view in Mission Control Hawthorne here at SpaceX headquarters. So we do see, we just had some great views of Dragon from the International Space Station. We've had views of the space station from Dragon. We use the tracking data relay satellite systems as we orbit around the Earth. So we have these handover periods when the space station's satellites are transferring essentially from one to the other, that KU band, as we were talking about, that video comms coming down. We have these short handover periods within which we're, again, switching those ground stations or the satellites, making sure we pick up shortly. So these are planned, or they're tracked, essentially. We can also extend these if needed. So sometimes we can get a little more time on a different satellite. Let's say we're on a spacewalk and we don't want to have maybe a 10-minute loss of comm. So we're able to work with the other users of these satellites or these ground stations and make sure that we're getting constant communication at that time. So right now we are taking views from Mission Control Hawthorne on the left, Mission Control Houston on the right, as we are getting into these dynamic operations when we will be seeing Dragon get even closer to the International Space Station.
And both of these teams on your screen are actively working. They're currently working in tandem, as we need both the team monitoring Dragon to coordinate with the team monitoring the International Space Station, as we are basically bringing the two together as we speak.
So again, we do expect to get those communications back, those videos back from Dragon and from the space station pretty shortly. But we are tracking to arrive at waypoint 1. Again, we're passing right through waypoint 1 today. We didn't have the need to stop. Both teams polled that they are go to pass through and head to waypoint 2. But we're expecting to see or hear that call out of waypoint 1 in just a couple of minutes. Again, we're tracking
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop, approach 1 and soft capture ring extension will begin shortly, and then expect Dragon to continue approach to waypoint 2.
SpaceX Dragon, copies all.
All right. Right on time. We are again expecting waypoint 1 arrival in just a couple of minutes. Docking could happen as soon as 10 minutes from now. Also heard the call to the crew that the soft capture ring extension will begin shortly. That's the first step in docking. We have soft capture, and this ring will retract, pulling Dragon into the International Space Station, that international docking adapter. And then there are a set of 12 hooks that will securely attach Dragon to the docking adapter. That's what we call hard capture. After that, we'll get into our depressurization of the vestibule.
And also a part of docking is where the Dragon spacecraft will actually connect an umbilical, set of umbilicals to the space station, basically provide power to Dragon while it's on the International Space Station.
So again, as we get closer to docking, if you are just joining us, this is NASA's SpaceX Crew-7 mission to the International Space Station. We have 4 members aboard Endurance today: Jasmine Mobelli, Andreas Mogensen, Konstantin Borisov, and Satoshi Furukawa. They are scheduled for about 10 minutes from now to arrive at the International Space Station, reaching waypoint 1 here, about 220 meters directly above their docking port. So we hear those Quindar tones. We like to pause to make sure that we can hear the real stars of the show. The teams in our mission control rooms talk with the crew members aboard the spacecraft.
We did expect to pass through waypoint 1 at 5:59 a.m. Pacific time. So that may be why they may be trying to establish comms here. We'll see if we can get an update here shortly.
Yeah, that's our crew. That's Crew-7. They will be arriving here just within the next 10 minutes, potentially. We have on the left, from the left, Jasmine Mogbelli, NASA astronaut and the commander of Crew-7. To her right, pilot Andreas Mogensen. Next to him is Satoshi Furukawa, JAXA, or Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency astronaut. And on the far right, Konstantin Borisov of Roscosmos.
Station, Houston on the Big Loop.
Houston Station, with you on the Big Loop.
Okay, Woody, we're ready for you to monitor approach per step 3 of 1.102 Dragon approach and retreat monitoring. Let us know when your review is complete and you are ready for docking.
Amy, I copy. Monitor approach per step 3. Review of steps 5 and 6 is complete, and ISS is ready for docking. Welcome, Crew-7.
Excellent. And for your awareness, at waypoint 2, Dragon will briefly pause to align for docking and then automatically resume approach.
Station copies.
All right, and that was communication from the Capcom and Mission Control Houston. It's Amy Dill this morning communicating with NASA astronaut Woody Hoberg on the International Space Station. Again, he's primed for monitoring this approach and docking of Dragon. So they are getting all set up on the space station side ahead of docking. Again, we're looking for that to happen around 6:08 a.m. Pacific time, so within the next few minutes.
Yeah, it's getting pretty exciting. Initial contact between Dragon and the International Space Station is expected, as Leah said, at 6:08 a.m. Pacific time, 9:08 a.m. Eastern time. Before reaching waypoint 1, mission operators conducted a go-no-go poll to allow Dragon to begin its approach to waypoint 2, which is located inside of the keep-out sphere, about 20 meters away from the space station.
As we've talked about previously, all of these visiting vehicles take this phased approach to the space station. They stop at these predetermined gates for teams to run quick checks on the vehicle performance before approaching the space station. So we know slow and steady wins the race when it comes to bringing two spacecraft together. The docking operations require a really great deal of precision to make sure we're keeping the spacecraft and obviously the crew safe.
At the 20-meter distance from station's docking adapter, Dragon's approach will slow, and it will begin to align itself with the adapter to come in for the final approach.
Dragon will make its first initial soft contact with the adapter's soft capture ring, which will then retract to bring Dragon in for the hard capture sequence. As a further precaution, Dragon's soft capture system includes a set of rotary spring dampers that helps lessen the force of the contact between the capsule and the station. So for a little bit more of an update on what's happening on the International Space Station and in Houston, let's check in with Sandra Jones. Sandra?
Thanks, Leah. Right now, the crew on board Space Station is awake and preparing for the upcoming docking of Dragon to Space Station. Everything continuing to look good here on the Space Station side. NASA
Dragon
astronaut
SpaceX
Woody Hoberg will...
Soft capture ring extension is complete.
SpaceX, the Dragon copy, soft capture ring deployed complete.
Good words there up to the crew. So as I was saying, Hoberg will be in the station's cupola using special software to track Dragon's approach and make sure it stays in the expected zones. Hoberg will also be primed for hatch opening operations once Dragon is docked. He'll start by opening the large hatch on node 2 Zenith, which will give him access into the pressurized mating adapter. The crew will then have to pressurize the vestibule, which is the small space between the hatches on Dragon and Space Station.
And
this
Dragon
was exposed
SpaceX
to
on the Big
vacuum
Loop
prior to
ground
docking.
has pulled go for approach 2. Please confirm visors are down and that you are ready for docking.
SpaceX Dragon copies on the big loop go, and all full crew members have visors down. We are ready.
Excellent news, Dragon. Ground is going to be enabling approach shortly, and a reminder that after the crew hands-off point, retreat and breakout are not permitted.
Dragon copies.
And great calls again up to the crew, letting them know everything is going smoothly. We're getting really close to docking, just confirming that they have their visors down and they can be in that configuration ahead of docking. So everything good here from the space station side. I'll toss it back over to Hawthorne so that you guys can give us an update on your end.
Thanks, Sandra. And we did hear the Corps also call out that CHOP, which is the crew hands-off point. Basically, that means that the crew must be hands-off. In case of any aborts that happen during that time, it will be done by Dragon. Now, waypoint 2 is up next, and that will put Dragon only 20 meters away from the space station. From here, the spacecraft will focus on aligning its docking system with the International Docking Adapter.
Yeah, so we're getting pretty close. Right now, it looks like we are about 80 meters from the International Space Station. Again, we did not stop at waypoint 1 today. We just kept on moving through that 220-meter mark. We will hold briefly at waypoint 2. That just gives us a chance to do any final checks, make sure everybody's go before moving in for docking. Additionally, we heard previously that the soft capture ring is extended. That's what's going to make first contact with the International Space Station. It will then pull Dragon into the International Space Station's International Docking Adapter before those 12 hooks begin to do that hard capture sequence, really securely securing it to the spacecraft.
And we are expecting initial contact between Dragon and the International Space Station any minute now.
Yeah, we are now 60 meters away from the space station. Again, this is really methodical. It's a very careful process as we prepare for docking, just to ensure the safety of the spacecraft. Like we mentioned, of course, the crew. And again, we do not have views from the International Space Station at this time, but we have good confirmation that Dragon is on the docking axis, continues to move in as planned. Sometimes we don't have these views as we are moving from satellite to satellite in the Tracking Data and Relay Satellite System known as TDRS. Additionally, sometimes we just don't have great views because it's nighttime on the space station. You know, we see sunrise or sunset every 45 minutes. They are in an orbital nighttime at this point. The International Space Station flying 265 statute miles south of Australia. Dragon now 40 meters from the space station, continuing to approach waypoint 2.
And there you can see on your screen, this is a view from Dragon approaching the International Space Station. You can see how close it is. You can begin to see those details on the station. And looking straight ahead in the center of your screen was the International Docking Adapter.
And this view from inside Dragon Endurance itself. So these are our 4 crew members. You can only see the commander and pilot right now, Jasmine Mogbelli and Andreas Mogensen, just monitoring the approach on those crew display panels. Again, they are not making commands at this point. Additionally, at that 2 meter 2 meters away from the space station, we'll hear the chop call, at which point they should not send any commands. Right now, we are at 23 meters from the space station, continuing to close in on that zenith port of Node 2. Down toward the bottom of your screen, you can see the nose cone of Dragon Endeavour, which brought the Crew-6 astronauts to the International Space Station. So we're expecting to hear the call for waypoint 2 shortly, where we will do a brief pause before moving in towards the docking port.
Also, a cool thing in this view is Dragon is now directly above the International Space Station, and you can tell in the view because you can see the clouds on Earth in the background.
And it looks like we have reached that 20-meter waypoint 2 mark.
Station, Houston on the Big Loop. Dragon is on final approach and is go for docking. Monitor per steps 5 and 6 in 1.102 Dragon approach and retreat monitoring.
Houston Station copies all.
All right, confirmation from Amy Dill, the Capcom in Mission Control Houston, to the crew that they are moving in for docking. So we are now 16 meters away from the International Space Station. Again, continuing slowly into the Node 2 Zenith port for docking today.
This is such a cool view. It almost feels like we're on Dragon approaching the International Space Station.
Space Station and Dragon now flying over Australia. And Dragon just 13 meters away. Again, a very methodical and careful approach to our docking port. Great views coming from Dragon this morning as we get ready to welcome 4 new crew members to the orbiting laboratory.
Dragon is at 10 meters.
Copy, 10 meters.
And we are just moments away from Dragon docking with the International Space Station. First will be a soft capture, and then there will be 12 hooks deploying 6 at a time to create that hard capture between the vehicle and the station.
Dragon now just 7 meters away, now 6 meters away from the Node 2 port.
5 meters.
Copy, 5.
That call coming from Dragon Commander Jasmine Mogbelli, her first spaceflight to the International Space Station. Standing by for the call of crew hands-off point, or CHOP.
Copy, CHOP.
1 meter.
And Dragon, we see soft capture complete, and attenuation will begin shortly.
Dragon, copy.
And contact confirmed. 6:16 a.m. Pacific time. 261 statute miles over Australia.
Guys, thank you for the welcome.
And that welcome coming from the crew aboard the International Space Station. Endurance has arrived with its international crew. They will begin the hard capture sequence shortly, but we are now up to 11 crew members on the International Space Station after they float through the hatch this morning.
And on the big loop, ring retraction is in progress.
Dragon, copy. Is ring retraction in progress.
Now, again, we don't have views right at this moment of Dragon on the International Space Station, but we did see that docking again at 6:16 a.m. Pacific time as the International Space Station and Dragon were flying 261 statute miles over Australia.
And there's still a few steps to complete before Dragon is securely attached to the station. We've now done the soft capture, but then there will be the completion of the soft capture ring retraction, as well as hard capture sequence beginning, and then finally hard dock completing. And again, that will require 12 hooks to deploy. Again, 6 at a time will deploy to make that hard capture completion.
Of course, once we have a successful hard capture, it still is going to take a little bit before we see our crew members float through the hatch into the International Space Station and officially bring us up to that total of 11, at least for about the next few days or so. We will first pressurize the vestibule. Well, Woody Hoberg will open the station side of the hatch. He will pressurize the vestibule, the space between both of those hatches, the Dragon hatch and the station hatch, bringing that to the same pressure as is inside Dragon and the space station. It's much of what we are used to here on Earth. Eventually, they will bring the crew members aboard. Again, they will give us a welcome ceremony. We'll get to see them and hear their first remarks about their visit to the space station, maybe what the ride was like. Then they will move right into work. They will start their safety briefing with the crew, making sure that they remember all their training from the ground, get brought up to speed on the International Space Station itself. This is Dragon Endurance's third visit to the International Space Station, first on Crew 3, then with Crew 5, now Crew 7. It joins Dragon Endeavour, both docked to the Node 2 module, also known as Harmony.
And that next step, soft capture ring retraction, is typically expected about 4 minutes after soft capture. So we should...
And Dragon, ring retraction is complete. The docking sequence is holding for MCS reconfiguration.
Dragon, copy.
And what perfect timing. Soft capture ring retraction is now complete.
As you mentioned earlier, during this time, we're also connecting an umbilical from Dragon to the station. Dragon has been using power generated by its solar arrays, also battery power. Once it's connected to the International Space Station, it can start using power from the station itself. You got a great view of those solar arrays as we were flying in this morning. And so at this point, Dragon will probably start using the station power for the remainder of its time on the space station over these next 6 months. And again, we do have soft capture complete for Dragon Endurance. We are standing by for the start of the hard capture sequence. This process takes several minutes, but it is the securing of 12 hooks from Dragon to the International Space Station, giving us that firm, secure hold.
MCS configured. Proceeding with hook driving.
And we did hear that call out, proceeding with hook driving. That is the beginning of the hard capture sequence. Again, as Leo was just mentioning, there will be 12 hooks, and they will deploy 6 at a time. So there'll be 6 hooks first. Once those are fully latched to the International Space Station, then the next set of 6 hooks will begin to deploy. And this process should take a few minutes, about 4 minutes or so, until hard docking is complete.
Again, we welcomed Crew-7 to the International Space Station at 6:16 a.m. Pacific time this morning. Here's your view inside Dragon Endurance right now over the shoulder of our commander, Jasmine Mogbelli, and pilot Andreas Mogensen. It was Mogbelli's first trip to the International Space Station and Mogensen's second. This is also Konstantin Borisov's first trip to the International Space Station. And Satoshi Furukawa is returning as well. So he is the most experienced on this crew when it comes to days in space. I believe he has 165 days from previous missions. This is the view that we saw as we were preparing for docking. It was giving us great views of the docking port itself. Now that we have completed that soft capture, we are obviously pulled into the space station. And those first 6 hooks are driving. We are, again, in the hard capture process right now. So we'll see those first 6 hooks drive, followed by the second 6, at which point they will be considered officially hard docked to the space station. We're getting some good progress on the hooks driving. It looks like the second 6 are now starting to drive.